Hi there, and thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our podcast and have a recommendation about someone you think that we should have on to share their voice and journey with the world, by all means, let us know. It could be an aid worker, monastic, author, journalist, doctor, resistance leader, really anyone with some tie or another to the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To offer up a name, go to our website, insightmyanmar.org, and let us know. But for now, just sit back and take a listen to today's podcast. I'm really happy on this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast to start the first interview of what we think will be several to follow with Jonathan Crowley, a friend on the path that I've known for many years. And it's great to finally get a chance to sit here and have an intimate conversation together, which will also be public and that we will explore and see where it goes. So Jonathan, thanks so much for taking the time to join us and talk about yourself and your path and practice.
Yeah, you're super welcome, Joa. It's great to connect with you and to, in some ways, continue conversations we started many years ago in Myanmar. So I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation. Thank you.
Yeah, and you really hit on something that was one of the impetus long before the coup, before the pandemic, of wanting to start the podcast, is having what I felt like were a series of really special, rarefied conversations with all kinds of people and wanting to find a way to bring those conversations out from where they were happening to a wider community, which is what we're doing now. So before we get into your practice and your meditation and your path, as we always do, and learning a bit about who the people are before they started practicing, if you could share a bit about your life growing up and your family and the influences and conditions that led you to start meditating, and take your time in telling however that lays out and progresses.
Sure. Great question. So I grew up in New York City, and I was born in 1964, and was born and raised in New York. Both of my parents were professionals, and I have two brothers. I think in some ways, meditation, some seeds around meditation were planted fairly early on, actually, really in some ways by my father. He was a kind of early psychiatrist with the early psychiatric movement in the United States in the 20s and 30s, the 1920s and 30s. And by the time I was born, he was actually looking at a lot of East-West influences that were beginning to impact the psychoanalysis at that time, and that included Krishnamurti, who he would go see live, and then he was reading a lot of Alan Watts, and I remember he gave me an early edition of Kahlil Gibran's book, and those planted a lot of seeds for me. But one thing he also did was he tried transcendental, or TM meditation at one point. And I just, I remember as probably an 11 or 12-year-old seeing him sitting in a chair with his eyes closed and wondering, what's going on? So that, these were significant seeds for me. And then, by the time I was in high school, I was definitely kind of, sort of being drawn to more really, I mean, in some ways, just philosophy, some mystical stuff, and exploring. And then I read, I think it was, well, I read a lot of Alan Watts's books, and then I also read Beginner's Mind, and that sort of, I think I began to really seek teachings and that sort of thing. What then happened was I was taking a 1-year therapeutic massage training, program. I had moved to Amherst, Massachusetts, and a number of teachers and some students were meditating at the Insight Meditation Society Center in Barre, Massachusetts, and I got a list of meditation centers from the person who made my massage table, and Goenka, SN Goenka Center was listed there as well. So I was also seeing in Amherst, in those days, the center would post, posters about their upcoming 10-day courses. And so all these things began to add up. And on my 20th birthday, I went to just like a long weekend, like a 4-day introductory meditation with, Larry, hold on a second. He's one of the founders of IMS. I'm forgetting his last name. Anyway, it'll come. So that was my first real taste of doing a retreat. And shortly after that, I was mentioning that I had done that. It was a big deal for me at the age of 20 to be silent for 4 days. I was mentioning it to someone at a shop, and the person said, well, if you thought that was interesting, you should try the 10-day course up in Shelburne. And so that planted a seed. And then about a year later, I went for my first 10-day course, and that was in 1987.
Right. So that was Dhamma Dhara in Shelburne Falls.
That's right. And it was a very, it was founded in 1981. And so it was still quite new and quite small at the time. They were doing courses, I think, for really only about, still 20, maybe between 25 and 40 students. The combination was still very simple, and the whole operation was really quite small. So.
Right. So yeah, you were there in somewhat the early days, just probably some years after the technique and the teachings and appointed teachers started coming from India and Burma to be able to lead them in the West. And that was definitely one of the first established centers that was in North America. So you don't know any of this coming in. You're just a young kid, just having probably very little idea, even among the difference of the traditions and techniques and such. But you go and take this intensive retreat. So what was the experience, as far as you can remember, back to that first 10-day course, what it was like being in it and then coming out?
Yeah, it was really hard. I think by the time I was going into it, I really was drawn to even, thinking about a monastic way of life. Was reading different books about that, and was, so in some ways it was a test. It was sort of testing the waters. But, by the 5th day, I, had broken down. I was crying. I didn't know what was going on. The task of being present every moment just seemed completely overwhelming. And I think I was even coming up, I wasn't really raised in a Christian household, but my schooling was very Christian. And I began to notice that I was, coming up against some of my own Christian conditioning around this notion of that some external entity, was going to somehow provide my salvation or something. And then, to be kind of challenged with being aware every moment, I thought, as a means of salvation, I was like, I can't do that. So I was really I was resisting it a lot all the way through. And then on the 10th day, which is it's a day for breaking silence and practicing loving kindness, I learned that it was actually a buffer day and that we'd have to stay another 24 hours before we actually could leave. And I was so ready to leave. So I actually attempted to, leave that day, and it didn't work out. There was no there was no reason to. And so, at the end of the whole thing, I said, well, I got this out of my system. And, I had no idea that, another year and a half later, I'd be back for my second retreat. And then, shortly thereafter, living at the center as what they call a sit server program, which is when you alternate between sitting 10-day courses as a student and then serving them as a volunteer.
Right. That's interesting. It's interesting how much that also parallels my first experience of taking my first course in Kyoto, Japan in 2001. Also just having excruciating pain of all sorts, mental, emotional, physical, every aspect, and feeling like this was the greatest experience I've ever had. And I don't know if I could ever do it again. That was really my feeling of it.
Yeah.
I ended up going back just only about 4 months later, just for like 3 or 4 days of a 10-day course when I had available. And that was also quite hard. It made me realize in my own development and path that I was a young kid living in Tokyo and had a pretty wild life, going out, staying up all night most weekends, going out to clubs and such, and was just realizing that if I can't have my feet in both boats, if I want to be serious about the spiritual path, I really need to give up the drinking and carousing and other things. And so I wait for my own path. I waited until I was able to come to a closure of what my life was like at that time. And then as soon as I had that closure, then, which was about a year and a half later, I went back to Kyoto to do the same thing, to basically live at that center and sit and serve for an extended period, which eventually brought me to Burma, as my own story goes. But so on your path, you go back a year and a half later, you go to a second 10-day course, and then eventually you also come to sit and serve at the center as a relatively new student, just having taken a couple courses similar to what I was doing as well there. So as you started to get deeper into the practice, into the organization, having friends that were also meditators and teachers, and having that, and especially once you start living at the center, that really just tremendously impacts your life. Talk a bit about that transformation and learning and what you're going through there.
Yeah, and it's neat. Our paths are parallel very much, Joe. So I think by the time shortly after my first 10-day course, I was 21, so I was still in my college years, and I was also trying to figure out those college years. I was a very non-traditional student, would take a lot of years off just to do programs that were edifying for me on a kind of a personal sort of development basis, and then trying to figure out how to get college credit for it. So I think I went back to a program where I traveled internationally through Central and South and the Latin Caribbean. And when I came back, I was really kind of exhausted, and it was an intense trip, and it was the first time visiting developing countries. And so to my surprise, I wanted to do a second 10-day course. And by that time I had one friend who had, in the meantime, sat a 10-day course. So I didn't know anyone when I first sat my 10-day course. And I think that was kind of a piece of it, that there was no one I could talk to about that experience. And it was a very profound experience. In many ways, after, for 6 months after my first 10-day course, I would say I was acutely processing it, and the impact of it, on an emotional level. And it was, in some ways, it was not I gave myself the time and space to do that. But looking back, I know after those first 6 months of my first 10-day course were really, really trying to digest the experience. And in some ways it was, I think, somewhat destabilizing. There were aspects in which, and And I was actually nervous to meditate again right after the 10-day course. It took me a while to. I think like many students, I think by the end of the 10-day course, you're able to sit an hour relatively, at ease. And but I was actually afraid to, and it took me a while to, and kind of coaxing myself really to begin to sit, have a daily practice that was significant, as I was digesting a lot of the, and it was really, in some ways, I think I was experiencing a lot of, it was so deep and so profound. And the kind of in some ways, the retreats pointers around renunciation and the ideal of the monastic life and certainly the meditator's life, it made me question everything. It made me question everything like I remember at one point asking myself, well, gosh, should I just put on a backpack and walk down the highways? Like what's my life about? Like it really caused me to question almost every single pathway that had been laid out in my life, including, going back to college and just like I was really asking myself, what is important? What is my purpose? What is and I think I was asking questions about the path in general or how to integrate the path, but it was so early on. And this initial experience was so intense that I didn't, I don't think I realized what was going on. And so that's why it was such a surprise that about a year and a half later, after this college program I was on, I felt ready to do that again, knowing full well what it was going to be like. And I think having a friend, knowing a friend, had done it as well was really important for me. So I went to my second 10-day retreat, and I think, again, as I said, I was resisting a lot on my first 10-day course. So on my second 10-day course, I knew, you might say I knew the drill, I knew what I was getting myself into. And so I was in some ways more attentive and less resistant and really taking it in and able to take it in. And I think I really learned more and understood what, Goenka was teaching and, was beginning to say, oh, okay, that's what this is. And it was a wonderful second 10-day course. And I, again, had a very profound experience of metta at the end of that 10-day course. I sometimes laugh about it, but I think, Goenka sometimes talks about a wellspring of metta, kind of sort of contacting a wellspring of metta. And I think that's what happened for me, because I was just in this sort of, I don't know, from the outside, I think it would have looked like a la-la state, I was just, I don't know, just in this space of really applying loving kindness, in all my interactions. And at the time I was woofing at a flower farm. We were growing flowers and making bouquets and selling them at farmers markets. And I remember at the end of making bouquets, there'd be all these leftover little teeny scraps of flowers. I would put them together in these little teeny bouquets, and I would go around just giving them to absolute strangers. And it was this zone I was kind of in from the course, but this time it was completely different. I felt, wow, this is amazing. And I almost felt like I had a secret superpower, literally. just the metta alone felt like, oh my God, I can do this anywhere. I can be mindful anywhere.
Right.
And no one even I don't have to talk about it. No one has to know that I'm with my breath and with my sensations and sending metta, And that was really, really quite an amazing revelation for me. And then what happened was this friend said to me, hey, why don't we go to the center and serve for a couple hours? And I said, what's that? And so we went up there, and, it was between courses. There were a number of other volunteer servers, around the kitchen. And it was, they were just getting ready for the next 10-day retreat. And then I remember seeing someone mowing the lawn, and that person sort of stopped and came up, and it turned out that he was my first teacher, Barry Lapping, and couldn't believe that, this person who I kind of, had seen from a distance. Of course, I had interactions with him on the 10-day course. But in some ways I was idealizing because he was on the dais, the teacher seat. I couldn't believe he was just mowing the lawn, at the center. And also the center itself, right? I was in some ways digesting the fact that the center itself was this just regular place. So I was just trying to, juxtapose that with this intense, life-changing experiences I just had. So it was great to go up there. And then that's when I learned about the sit-serve continuous program that was happening. And I think they were just starting it actually then. Or, there had been some people who had done it informally, but they were going to sort of make it an official program. And I think I was one of two of the first applicants for the sit-serve program at Dhamma Dhara.
Wow, that's amazing. And it also just brings up so many memories in my own path as well. I remember after my first course and for several courses, it also was it had turned everything on its head that I thought I knew about who I was and what I wanted to be, and exposing certain defilements and liberation from those. And I remember, and I didn't know how to integrate it. I was so confused how to put this into who I was and integrate it. And I think that's going to be a lot of this conversation going forward, is how as Westerners we integrate not just a spiritual practice that has its roots in the East, but also through the medium specifically of the Goenka organization and the culture and teachings that they instill. But for me at that early age, I just remember thinking I was probably a year older than you, maybe 22, 23 when I started doing it. And I remember thinking I've up to this point, I've been so goal oriented in what I want to achieve. And that drive for achievement has been masking these things inside myself I can't bear to look at and don't think I can ever change. This shows me a way to change them. But what does that mean for the things I still want to achieve? And what it meant for me at that age was I can work at a gas station the rest of my life and just be happy and peaceful. And I remember having serious conversations with my family and my parents about how I don't need anything anymore. I can just get a job at the local gas station and just be peaceful and mindful and live a good, fulfilling life. And they were just incredibly alarmed at what am I practicing and what am I doing? This is not a great life goal for a recently, a recent college graduate and whatnot. And that took a lot of my own journey to start to realize how to not so much block off entire ambitions and aspirations of myself and of my being, but how to more cultivate very carefully certain this cocktail of thing we have, the cocktail of ambitions and intentions we have in us, which is obviously an ongoing process. But I'm
chuckling, Joe, because so many similar things there around, the ambition, achievement, what you're conditioned. And if you don't mind, I think I'll turn back a little bit just to say what was happening to me before my first 10-day course. Because for my elementary and high schooling, I was educated in an independent school in New York, and it was very high pressure. And it was sort of a conveyor belt school to, Ivy League schools. And when I came out of that, I was really disillusioned. And partly because I didn't feel like I knew myself. So this is, at the age of 18. And I said, I kind of took a vow for myself. I'll never allow that kind of, I'll never put myself through that kind of educational experience. And I was very, but my father was a psychiatrist in New York. My mother was also a professional. She was a literary agent. I was in a school with the upper crust of, even though my family was not at that, sort of level, I was in a school with upper crust folks from, kids from New York. And it was, those expectations were kind of raining down on me in a similar way, I think, that as you're describing. And I had already begun a process of, in some ways, actively challenging them and or looking for alternatives. I think what's significant to mention is just that prior to sitting my first 10-day course, I underwent about a couple years of intensive body-centered therapy. And again, I was addressing issues kind of coming out of my family of origin. There were some alcoholism issues in my family that I was addressing. And, I was really, really drawn to holistic health. That was a huge, I was in this therapeutic massage program intensive for a year. It was looking at, the whole self, how to, just aspects of the whole self and healing. And so that was the pretext for going into my first 10-day course. I'm the son of a psychiatrist. I had undergone a very intensive period of, psychotherapy via a body-centered method. And I was enrolled in, this very in-depth holistic healing program. So, that theme of integration that you mentioned was in some ways important to me from the get-go. Mm-hmm. And I think our, as we kind of continue the conversation, it'll be interesting to just go more in depth about how that sort of took prominence for me. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where there's definitely a the pre first course, I think, is definitely where there's some divergence between us, because I was just partying on all times of the night in Tokyo for the couple of years before I took my first course, and so I didn't have. I remember at the time talking to other people that were my age that had started to do yoga or follow certain kind of dietary things or live in nature or something, and so their first course was very difficult, but also kind of the next step in line, even though it was a very big step from what they'd already done. For me, it was, I was very interested in spirituality and the subconscious and psychedelics at that time, and just and Carl Jung and Castaneda, all these different influences that were coming at me, but I didn't have an understanding. I mean, the thing that was really a shock to my system and my friends at the time who I ended up bringing in to do it was this idea that ethical living and what are ethics, even, because at that time that just all seemed subjective, but that ethical living actually had some bearing on the spiritual experience. That was just, those were two things that had never crossed my mind. So it wasn't that I was living, I wouldn't say that I was living a hedonistic life at the time, even though I was engaged in all that, because the intention was not fun. It wasn't just to be young and have a crazy time. The intention with everything I was doing then was wanting to learn more about myself and go deeper into myself and understand what the world was and how to have a fulfilling life. But I just didn't understand that ethical component, and that was the thing that Theravada meditation, Theravada Buddhism, vipassana meditation, the Goenka discourse, whatever you want to call it, that whole experience turned the light on of where following ethics is integrated and plays into the greater spiritual path. And that was something that set me out on that. But it sounds like for you that's this kind of holistic, natural way of living was something that you were already working towards in many ways. And so, and being aware of the body and healing and those kinds of things. And this was just another layer on top of, or another step, a very important and extremely significant step, but going towards the direction that you'd already been interested in prior to that time.
Yeah, I would say that's correct. I think I was beginning to take those steps on different levels. I remember I was, just prior to my first 10-day course, I was living in households that, we had sort of a, no alcohol, no drug policy. We were vegetarian. I had just come out of a year-long environmental program as well, where there was an emphasis on that kind of living. So to see, and then of course, just coming out of just my family of origin, I knew the harms of, so I was definitely on a healing path on those fronts. had done some Al-Anon work, and, saw the harm, right? Saw the harm and that, and knew that, in some ways, that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to go to traditional university or college, was because I didn't want to live, in dorms and that culture that I knew was a big part of it. So I was, I was already taking, a couple of years off by the time I went in my first 10-day course. And in some ways, I characterize myself as sort of, beginning to slip through the cracks, right? That I remember reading about, from, say, Ram Dass and Timothy Leary, just kind of slipping through the cracks of conventional or traditional or, society's expectations on that level. And was actually even, on a renunciate level, embracing some of that. I remember reading a book called, Chop Water, Carry Wood. And it was kind of just discussing, some ways a very simple monastic, but lay lifestyle, around. And I was living in a cabin without electricity and running water, and it was just biking to work. So I was definitely taking those steps. And this was then kind of, another furthering of that. And it was also intensive for me. It was still, really super hard. And I think that's why the questioning afterwards was like, oh, okay, so what does this mean? Where am I going? I thought I was on this kind of general, I would say I would probably typify myself as being in the new age, as sort of a new ager type, or a budding new ager, you might say. And I was like, okay, that cut through even all of that, right? It just cut through it's a very valid world, of course, but, it cut through some of the superficial aspects of that. It cut through, I just went to the root of like, oh my gosh, what is purpose? What is the purpose of my life? So it was then kind of a surprise to come back. And then, another 3 months later, I was living at the center. And
I think you hit on a really interesting thing, because that early Goenka Vipassana experience, what it does to many people, certainly to me, and it sounds like to you as well, is you go in thinking, I'm this kind of person, I believe in this kind of thing, I have this kind of value. And it just strips away those labels and just lays bare. And I think that also becomes some of the conundrum in going through with Goenka meditation, as we'll get to later, that it at least for me, it started to feel labelless. It started to feel like there is no label here. It's removed all context and labeling, and this is just what is. And actually there are labels going on there at a deeper level that takes a bit more experience to be able to uncover and find. But the initial experience, the shock of that, really just strips bare away what one thinks one is, and in that silence and in that technique. But staying with where you are now. So it sounds like these first two courses were kind of like your all these other things in the world, and then you're going and taking a course and going back to the world. But then when you go and sit and serve, living at the center for that period at least, and maybe thereafter, you're becoming something new. You're not just touching and experiencing and bringing it back to your life, but you're actually now becoming something, a part of this organization and technique, and it's becoming a part of you. I don't know if that's fair to say. I'll turn it over to you and share just what this transformation was like as you started to go deeper with this extended experience, actually living in the center.
Yeah. And I was definitely, again, I was searching for pathways. I was, almost when I would finish some kind of educational program, whether it was accredited or not, I would sort of, think about, okay, what's the next step? Where, and I really was not following a traditional, 4-year college thing. And I didn't even really know how I was going to accredit some of the programs I was doing, but I was following just my own heart and my just my sense of idealism about what I sort of needed next. And so when this opportunity came up, I remember, it was it was juxtaposed with another choice. I was going to do, I think, sort of an intensive theater training. And I was choosing, okay, what else should I do? Should I sit serve or should I go? And I chose to go to the center and live there for 8 or 9 months. And yeah, I knew coming into it that, oh, this is going to be something, to be doing this, back to back, retreats. And I didn't, but I looked at it also as a kind of another program that I had enrolled in, and that was part of this, this path, sort of, what I was going to be, doing around, that was going to inform sort of my higher education. And in many ways, it was a higher education, just in a very profound way. So I landed at the center, and it was kind of hilarious because I was so nervous, and not knowing what was really expected of me. And it was hilarious. There was a sit server there when the afternoon or evening I landed, and they said, "Hey, well, you want to go to a movie?" And they took me out to a movie. I was like, "Oh, thank God!" Just okay, it's normal. Things are normal. Right. So, I began a journey of. In those days, the sit serving program was, you would sit a 10-day course, and then you would serve one or two, and then you would sit another 10-day course, serve one or two, and then sit another 10-day course. So I was pretty much going back to back retreats right on through, between, September of that year through May. And it was, the center was growing. There was construction going on. So it was looking even different from the previous times I'd been there. And I entered this world of really seeing kind of behind the scenes, behind the curtain of the center. And in some ways beginning to identify myself around being a server. I began to both manage courses in the kitchen as well as do course management. Those are positions where you are, taking more responsibilities on in terms of, the retreat, the logistics of the retreat. And so you're, in some ways, you're representing, you begin a process of representing the tradition, or the, two new folks who are newer, who are there. So, typically there might be, I think at that time, there might be like 8 servers. Some of them may have just done one course or so, but, and then I was also meeting very experienced meditators in the Goenka tradition, and getting to know that world of, the trustees who made the center operate, and ATs who, that was still a fairly new program at that time. There were ATs in place, and there were also ATs who were, I think they had kind of started beginning to create senior assistant teachers, and I think at the time there was another one called it wasn't the full teacher, but there was another term for it at the time. So, I was getting to know that world, and that period of time certainly had a very deeply conditioning, and experience on me.
I'll be honest, not only is asking for donations my least favorite thing in the world to do, I find it pretty uncomfortable as well. Yet, it is an unavoidable but necessary task in order to ensure that our platform can continue to bring you stories from post-coup Myanmar. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that there is a basic minimum cost to keep our engine humming. So please allow me to take a moment for that least favorite and uncomfortable thing to do, and ask sincerely for your generosity in supporting our mission. If you found value in today's show and think others might as well, we ask that you take a moment to consider supporting our work. Thank you for taking the time to hear our spiel. And with that, it's off to work on the next episode. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam